Hello, I'm Ryan Day from Block. And for anyone who isn't sure, Block is actually Square. So for all intents and purposes, we're just talking about Square today.
So, Tim Winston from AWS. I work with the AWS payment cryptography team, both on the compliance of the service and helping customers with compliance.
Yeah, I'm Skylar Ferran. I'm a principal at Coalfire. I'm QSA, QPA, in this case, PIN, and work to help make sure our clients are meeting the requirements in a way that supports them and protects the data.
So you probably know Square as selling devices like this for small merchants to use as their POI. A device like this is pre-injected with keys that are from an HSM sitting in our backend. So the data comes in, is translated to our upstream partner, and maintain compliance with PCI PIN. Another aspect of a product like this, though, is that what we're really selling to our customers is time, which makes us very, very sensitive to availability. A few years ago, with everyone else, we began migrating some of our services from our data centers to cloud-based providers. And so eventually, over time, as more and more apps were moved to AWS and our other cloud service providers, eventually we were asked the question, what about these HSMs? How do we get rid of these things and move them outside of the various data centers in which we keep them? That's when we met Tim and we met his team.
Good. So, for years I was a PIN and P2P assessor, and I sat watching key ceremonies and how HSMs were installed in data centers and commissioned and decommissioned. And then at AWS, I helped a lot of customers in developing our papers and curriculum on achieving DSS compliance with cloud applications, and really came to feel like, boy, if there's any undifferentiated heavy lifting, it's dealing with cryptography, key management, and HSMs. And that we felt we could design a service that would allow a lot of the responsibility for key management and cryptography to be shifted to the service provider. So when we looked at designing a payment cryptography service, one of our goals was to see how much responsibility we could shift to AWS and how we could minimize the customer's efforts. We can't eliminate it, but how much we could minimize the customer's efforts to be PIN compliant.
There we go.
Oh, good. So really critical to this, if you're going to take on that responsibility, it means taking ownership of the HSMs, the HSM lifecycle, the main or master key management, and really the protection of all keys. And holding those keys, enforcing key block usage, adhering to the attributes of key blocks, and really, everything from the loading, storage, use, destruction, all the key management life cycle. And so being able to do that, provides developers with a service. Now they can just use web service APIs, just like they do with other cloud services, and be able to accomplish payment cryptography and have an application that they could deploy in any global region where the service is supported. And instead of having to use, ASCII-based serial HSMs interfaces that are, common to the most popular payment HSM. And so part of this goal of minimizing the customer responsibility, when we take on the protection and the protection of all the keys, the protection to the HSMs, it really allows this service. This kind of illustrates how much of the responsibility that we as a service provider can take on, as opposed to customer using HSM as a service, where their HSM lifecycle may be provided for, but they're still totally responsible for all the key management, HSM administration, HSM access control, all the other key management responsibilities. And you will notice I said you can't eliminate that. Like any other cloud service or any service provider, there's a shared responsibility, and we'll do what you tell us to do. So if you tell us to do something not valid, then that's part of your responsibility, and Skylar will find you out. Go ahead. So this approach really allowed building a secure service like, it's the cloud. If we're not secure, we don't protect your data, no one will use any cloud service. So it allowed to build us on the structures that have been developed for the cloud, a service that could get third-party assurance and accelerate the deployment of applications that need payment cryptography to any global region.
So when we first started talking about this, Coalfire's been working with Block and with AWS for a long time now, and we started talking about doing PIN in the cloud, and my first thought is, yeah, it's probably not going to happen, but it was an exciting opportunity. We got to build on some of the previous successes and start talking about what would be some of the hurdles or difficulties here. A couple that we thought about is, okay, first off, what is this? Is this a cloud HSM that's just bare metal hardware being connected to a cloud environment, or is it more of a service that's doing PIN transactions and being treated as such? When we figured that out, okay, with this service, which controls are being, one, appropriate for the overall solution? Next, which ones are being handled by the cloud service provider, by AWS, and which are the responsibility of the PIN entity, in this case, Block? And then how do we start establishing key management? In a cloud environment, you're not doing key ceremonies there at the HSM. I think most cloud providers probably don't want folks crawling around in there plugging in keyboards or KLDs. So we had to figure out how are those keys going to be established, especially the top level keys. And then also, how are we handling our HSM lifecycle in an environment that's inherently a little bit more elastic than what you would see in a traditional PIN environment, especially when you need automation to be able to scale in those various regions and areas to really support and grow. So some of the sort of unique approaches we took, we're looking at things like, okay, well, are there some hybrid controls we can take for some of these things that are traditionally done more physically? Are we able to take logical controls or a mix of logical controls and physical approaches taken by AWS personnel to meet things that almost every other PIN entity out there is doing in person, hands-on? We also talked a lot about key conveyance, and Tim mentioned this with the APIs that were built. How do we structure this? And we were able to structure it so that we can have keys conveyed to AWS as payments cryptography as a service to be able to keep those meeting the compliance all the way through, generate keys underneath those, and process our transactions, PIN translations as we go there. And then HSM inspections, that was a tough one. Anybody familiar with PIN knows you have to do routine inspections, especially before any key management. So how do you roll that into a cloud environment, and one that's constantly growing, elastic, and not particularly hands-on? Well, we were able to take some approaches where we combine physical tools, remote tools, technological controls, and be able to appropriately hit those requirements.
Yeah.
So what's the result?
Seat time, yeah. And the airplane seat time.
Yeah.
So what's the result of all this? We have a few takeaways that we think everyone could benefit from. First, it's possible. That was our first challenge of even establishing that it was possible. I do want to say and point out, we're not quite done. When this talk was submitted, we were planning on being done, but we've had to move timelines out for things having nothing to do with this assessment. But there are a few things you have to do in order to make it possible. One of them is advanced planning and collaboration. We've had some interesting challenges with the standard and how it's usually implemented, as you've heard. And as a result, we've had to be very open with all of our technology stack, more so than we would generally be in a standard assessment. Vendors tend to want to hold back some information that they don't think is relevant to an assessment to just try to limit scope and keep everybody going where they're supposed to be going. And in this particular project, there's none of that. Everything is wide open. Skylar and Tim have a lot of knowledge about our internal processes. That way we can get one full assessment of the entire product. Another takeaway from this is actually the amount of output from this project that's also being fed into PCI. With the new engagement models, we're able to provide this feedback, hopefully for the benefit of everyone else. Last but not least, everything comes with risk. Much like our keynote mentioned earlier, every new feature, every new piece of functionality has to be managed very carefully and planned for 5+ years down the road. Tim's team has really done a great job in trying to get ahead of that and plan for all of our benefit. That's everything. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask any of us. I'm sure we'd love to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Slide.